It was Father's Day when the box came. I was sitting on the front porch, coffee cooling in my hand, the June sun already sliding down the shingles like melted gold. My knees ached the way they always did when the morning damp crept in, but for once, I didn't mind. Father's Day had a way of softening even the stubborn bones of an old man like me. You spend years wondering if your children still think of you, if they still see you as the same anchor you once tried to be. So when the mail truck pulled up and the driver handed me a small package with my daughter's name scribbled in the corner, my heart did something I hadn't felt in years. It skipped. It wasn't big, this box. About the size of an old Bible, the kind we used to keep on the kitchen counter. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, the tape uneven, almost hurried. But there it was, my daughter's handwriting. I knew it instantly, even though it had been months, years, maybe since I'd last seen it on anything addressed to me. I turned the package in my hands like it might explain itself. She remembered, I thought. She remembered Father's Day. And then I heard her voice, not my daughter's, my wife's. "Don't open it." Her words cracked the air like a whip. I looked up. She was standing in the doorway, dish towel still in her hands, her face pale. Not annoyed, not casual. No, she was frightened. The kind of fear that makes your chest tighten even if you don't understand it. "What do you mean, don't open it?" I asked, trying to laugh, but the sound felt hollow. "It's from our daughter. She sent it for me for Father's Day." My wife stepped forward quickly, almost tripping on the mat. She reached for the box, but I pulled it back instinctively. Something in me, the father in me, wanted to protect it. "You can't see," she whispered. I frowned. "See what?" Her eyes flicked to the box like it was something alive, dangerous even. She shook her head, muttering under her breath, then turned away, leaving me there with the package pressed against my chest. That was the first moment I realized something was wrong. The rest of the morning felt heavy. I carried the box inside, set it on the coffee table. Every time I walked past it, my wife stiffened. She busied herself with chores, scrubbing counters that didn't need scrubbing, rearranging shelves that didn't need arranging. But her eyes never stopped darting toward that little brown box. I tried to make small talk, tried to ease the tension. "Maybe it's a tie. She knows I've worn the same one for 20 years, or socks. Lord knows I need them." My wife didn't smile. "You should call her," she said flatly. "Ask her why she sent it." "Why don't I just open it?" I replied, gentler than I felt. Her hands trembled as she wiped the counter again. "Not yet." That answer rattled me more than anything. Not yet. Like she knew what was inside. Like she was waiting for something. You'd think after 60 years of living, a man would be done with mysteries. My days should have been about routine. The morning coffee, the evening walk, the Sunday calls to my daughter if she remembered. But suddenly, this box turned all that upside down. I sat down in my armchair across from it, staring at it the way you stare at a storm rolling in from the horizon. You don't know when it'll hit, but you know it's coming. It's funny how life sneaks up on you. You think you've buried the past deep enough. You think silence can cover what words never dared to say. But sometimes the truth has a way of finding its way back, wrapped in brown paper, sitting on your coffee table, daring you to tear the tape. And maybe that's why I couldn't. Not yet. All day the box lingered in my thoughts. My daughter, my only child, had grown distant these past years. Not in the loud, angry way families sometimes fall apart. No, hers was the quiet withdrawal, shorter phone calls, fewer visits, excuses about work, about being busy. The kind of distance that feels like a slow leak. You don't realize the house is flooding until you're knee-deep in water. And now this. A box on Father's Day. I wanted to believe it was love. I wanted to believe she remembered her father not as the man hunched in a recliner with bad knees, but as the one who once carried her on his shoulders at the county fair, who patched her skinned knees when she fell off her bike. I wanted to believe the box was her way of saying, "I see you, Dad." But my wife's reaction gnawed at me. Fear. Real fear. What could possibly be inside that box? That night, as we sat down for dinner, the tension thickened. My wife barely touched her food. I tried to bring up old memories, hoping to cut through the silence, but every story fell flat. Finally, I said it out loud. "I'm going to open it tomorrow." Her fork clattered against the plate. She stared at me, lips pressed tight. "Don't," she whispered. I leaned back, folding my arms. "It's my gift from my daughter on Father's Day. Why shouldn't I?" She shook her head. For the first time in a long time, I saw tears in her eyes. "Because once you do, things won't be the same." I wish I could explain what it felt like to hear that. It was as though the ground beneath my chair shifted. What could possibly be so heavy, so life-changing, that my wife would rather I never opened it? I looked at her, the woman I had built decades with, and realized I didn't recognize her face in that moment, not the way she looked at the box, not the way her voice shook. And so I made a decision. I would wait, not out of fear, not out of obedience, but because I wanted to see where this would lead. Sometimes, waiting tells you more than rushing in, so I left the box unopened. That night, lying in bed, I could feel its presence from the other room. It was ridiculous, I knew, but it was as if the box was breathing, whispering, waiting. I stared at the ceiling, listening to my wife's uneven breathing beside me, and thought, whatever's inside, it's not just paper and string. It's a story someone tried to bury, and now it was clawing its way back. So here I am, telling you this story, not because I want pity, not because I want attention, but because life has a funny way of testing us, doesn't it? A little box can shake the ground you've walked on for decades. I don't know what you would do if it had been you on that porch, coffee in hand, box in lap, wife trembling in the doorway. Maybe you would have ripped it open. Maybe you would have tossed it in the trash. But me, I held it close. Because for the first time in years, I felt like my daughter had reached out, and no fear, not even my wife's, could take that away. So stay with me. Walk through this with me. Because by the time this story is done, you'll see why that little box on Father's Day was more than just a gift. It was the beginning of everything unraveling. And if you're here listening, thank you. These stories, they don't mean much without someone on the other end. So if you find yourself pulled in, if you want to walk the rest of this road with me, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. Because what's inside that box? It's not just mine anymore. The box stayed on the coffee table, and it was the first thing I saw when I woke the next morning. I came downstairs, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and there it sat, quiet, unmoving, as if it had spent the night waiting for me. The morning light hit it differently now, sharp through the blinds like a spotlight on a stage prop no one had the courage to touch. I poured my coffee and tried to ignore it, but ignoring it felt like ignoring a toothache. It throbbed, even in silence. My wife was already in the kitchen, humming to herself in that nervous, tuneless way she always did when something weighed on her. She didn't look at the box, but I could feel the tension rolling off her. "You're up early," I said, trying for normal. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. She kept her back to me, chopping vegetables for a stew no one had asked for. I sat at the table, coffee warming my hands. My eyes strayed back to the box. And for the first time, I wondered, what if my wife wasn't just afraid? What if she was guilty? It's a terrible thing to think about your own spouse. We've been married 40 years. 40 years of raising a child together, paying bills, fighting and making up, Christmas mornings and long hospital nights. You don't just wake up one day and look at your wife like she's a stranger. But the truth is, distance doesn't always happen overnight. Sometimes it grows in the little cracks, a secret kept, a truth bent, a silence that lasts too long. You patch over it with routine and habit. But when the patch tears, you see the fracture has been running beneath the surface all along. That's what I felt now, sipping coffee while my wife busied herself with carrots and onions. A crack had opened, and the box, my daughter's box, was wedging it wider. My daughter. When I think of her, I don't picture her as the woman she is now, with her sharp suits and her busy calendar, always on the move. No, I see her as the little girl in a yellow sundress, hair tangled from the wind, running across the lawn with a laugh so pure it seemed to carry the whole sky with it. Back then, she clung to me. She'd crawl into my lap, press her tiny hands against my chest, and tell me I was her favorite person in the whole wide world. Where did that little girl go? I guess she grew up. They all do. She went off to college, moved to a city, built a life where I was more memory than presence. That's the way it's supposed to be, I know, but it doesn't stop the ache. So when the box came, when I saw her handwriting, It was like a rope thrown into the dark. Proof that maybe she hadn't forgotten her old man. Proof that maybe I still mattered. That's why my wife's reaction cut me so deep. Because if this gift was really about me, why was she so afraid of it? I tried calling my daughter that afternoon. I told myself it was just to thank her, to let her know the package had arrived. But really, I wanted answers. The phone rang 4 times before her voice came through. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was warm, tired but warm. For a moment it melted something in me. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, "I got your package." Silence. "You did?" she asked cautiously. "Yes, it's sitting right here. But your mom, she doesn't want me to open it." I waited for her to laugh, to tell me not to be ridiculous, that it was just a gift. Instead, I heard her inhale sharply. "Dad," she said softly, "just hold on to it. Don't let it out of your sight. One day soon you'll understand." Her words settled like stones in my chest. "What do you mean I'll understand? Why not now?" "Because," she trailed off. I could hear voices in the background, muffled. "Because the truth has its time, and when that time comes, I want you to be ready." Before I could push further, she ended the call. I sat there, phone in hand, staring at the silent screen. The truth has its time. What kind of daughter says that to her father? When my wife came into the room, she asked casually, "Did you talk to her?" "Yes," I said. "And she told me to hold on to the box." I watched her face carefully. A flicker of something crossed it, relief, maybe fear. It was hard to tell. Then she smiled, thin and tight. "Good, so let's just leave it be." Leave it be. Those words crawled under my skin. That evening I went for a walk. I needed air, space, a chance to think without the box breathing down my neck. The neighborhood was quiet, just the sound of sprinklers and the faint buzz of cicadas. I passed the homes of families I'd known for years. Kids who had once played in our yard, now grown, parents older. Slower. Life moves on with or without your permission. I wondered what the neighbors would think if they knew what sat in my living room. A box no one dared open. A wife who trembled at the sight of it. A daughter who spoke in riddles. Would they laugh, shake their heads, or would they whisper the way people do when they suspect something dark, something hidden? Because deep down I suspected the same. When I got home, the house was dark. My wife had gone to bed. I stood in the living room, the glow of the streetlight falling through the window, casting the box in pale shadow. I reached out, brushing my fingers across the paper wrapping. It felt ordinary. Nothing about it suggested danger. Nothing about it explained why my family seemed to orbit around it like it was the sun itself. I thought of tearing it open right then and there. My hands even gripped the tape. But something stopped me. Not fear exactly. More like instinct, the kind that tells you not to step on a loose board, not to rattle the cage of an animal you can't see. So I let go. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, maybe. That night, lying awake beside my sleeping wife, I felt the distance more than ever. There are silences in marriage that are comfortable, like a blanket on a cold night. And then there are silences that smother you, pressing down on your chest until you can hardly breathe. This was the second kind. I realized then that the box wasn't just about my daughter. It wasn't just about some secret folded inside. No, the box was about my marriage too. About the cracks we'd ignored, the truths we'd buried. And for the first time in a long time, I wondered if I had the strength to face them. Life is strange. You spend years thinking the big moments will come with fireworks, with celebrations, announcements, milestones. But sometimes the big moments arrive quietly, in plain wrapping on an ordinary morning. Sometimes the thing that changes everything is small enough to fit in your hands. And as I closed my eyes that night, one thought haunted me more than all the rest. If my daughter sent me the truth, then what had my wife been hiding all these years? The morning after my walk, I woke to the sound of a phone ringing. It wasn't mine. It was the old landline in the kitchen, the one my wife insisted we keep even after everyone else in the neighborhood had moved to cell phones. I lay there for a moment, listening. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped and I heard her voice, soft, hurried, almost a whisper. At first I thought she was talking to herself. But then I caught the rhythm of a conversation, the pauses, the low hum of another voice on the other end. I couldn't make out the words, not clearly, but I knew what I heard in her tone: secrecy. I sat up in bed, the old frame creaking beneath me. My knees ached as I swung my legs over the side, but the ache didn't matter. Something else pulled me forward, the instinct of a man who knows when something in his house doesn't belong. I moved quietly down the hallway, careful not to let the floorboards groan under my weight. The closer I got to the kitchen, the clearer her words became. "He can't find out," she whispered sharply. "Not now, not ever." A pause. "I told you she sent it anyway. I don't know why. She wasn't supposed to. He's already asking questions." My breath caught in my throat. I leaned against the wall, my heart hammering like it hadn't in years. My wife's back was to me, her hand gripping the receiver tightly. She sounded frantic, her voice breaking in places I'd never heard before. "I'll handle it," she said finally, her words a hiss. "I'll make sure the box stays closed, but if he opens it—" Another pause, the silence stretched. Then she added, "Everything will come apart." I stepped back quickly, nearly stumbling over the rug in the hall. She turned, glancing over her shoulder, and I barely slipped into the shadows before her eyes could land on me. For a long moment I stayed there, pressed against the wall, my chest rising and falling like I'd just run a mile. "Everything will come apart." The words burned in my mind. When she finally hung up the phone, I returned to the bedroom, pretending to be half asleep when she walked in. She smiled tightly, too tightly, and said, "I'll make us breakfast." I nodded, feigning drowsiness, but inside my thoughts raced. Who was she talking to? What could possibly be so terrible that my daughter's gift, my Father's Day gift, threatened to unravel it all? I thought of the box again, sitting in the living room, innocent and silent. My hands itched to tear it open right then, but I remembered my daughter's voice on the phone. "One day soon you'll understand." Soon, not now, so I waited. Breakfast that morning was strained. My wife hummed to herself as she flipped pancakes, but her hands shook as she poured the batter. I pretended not to notice, though every nerve in me was raw. She asked me about the weather, about whether I'd mow the lawn later. Mundane things, but each question felt like a smoke screen, like words thrown into the air to cover the silence underneath. I chewed slowly, studying her face. It was the same face I'd known for decades, the same woman I'd fallen in love with in my 20s, and yet not the same. There was something in her eyes now, something guarded, like a locked door behind glass. After breakfast, she disappeared into the garden. She said she needed to pull weeds, though I doubted there were many left. I stayed inside, circling the living room like a restless dog. The box, always the box. I picked it up again, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, not physically, but it carried something that pressed against my chest, something I couldn't name. I set it back down, sat in my armchair, and closed my eyes. And in that darkness, old memories began to stir. Years ago, there had been another morning like this, another whisper in the kitchen. I remembered coming home late from work, my clothes still smelling of the factory floor, and finding my wife at the sink scrubbing furiously at a cloth stained deep red. She'd startled when I walked in, her hands trembling. She told me she'd cut herself, nothing serious. She held up her finger, wrapped hastily in a bandage. But the blood there had been too much, far too much for a small cut. I'd let it go then. I told myself I was tired, imagining things, but the memory had never quite left me. It lived in the corners of my mind, gathering dust like an old photo you can't bring yourself to throw away. Now, with the box on my table, that memory roared back, louder than ever. That evening, I tried again to talk to my wife. "Who were you on the phone with this morning?" I asked casually, as though it were nothing. She froze for a fraction of a second, then smiled. "Just a friend." "Which friend?" Her smile faltered. "Does it matter?" "Yes," I said quietly, "it does." For a moment her eyes met mine, and in them I saw the flicker of fear again. She looked away, busying herself with the dishes, and said, "It's nothing for you to worry about. Nothing for me to worry about." The words landed like a slap. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My wife's back was turned to me, her breathing steady but not peaceful, and all I could think was this: my daughter sent me a box. My wife doesn't want me to open it. And whatever truth it holds, it has been waiting in the shadows of this house for far longer than I realized. Secrets are like weeds. You think you've pulled them up, but the roots remain, twisting beneath the soil, waiting for their moment to surface. And as I closed my eyes, I knew those roots were coming for me. The box hadn't moved. It never did, of course. But every time I passed through the living room, it was as though it shifted somehow, following me with its silence. I tried ignoring it. I tried distracting myself with chores, with old books, even with the television, though nothing on that screen seemed worth watching anymore. But the moment I stopped, even for a breath, my eyes slid back toward the coffee table and the box stared back at me. That evening, as I sat alone, I felt something stir, not in the room but in me. Memories half buried began to claw their way upward. It was 20 years ago, maybe more. Time is slippery that way. It doesn't announce when a moment will matter, doesn't give you a marker to circle on a calendar. Only later, when something awakens it, do you realize that was the moment everything began to crack. I had been working late shifts back then, long hours in a plant that smelled of oil and iron. One night, I came home well past midnight. The house was quiet, the neighborhood asleep, but when I stepped inside, I heard water running. The kitchen light was on. My wife stood at the sink, scrubbing something so furiously that her knuckles turned white. "Hey," I said, dropping my lunch pail onto the counter. "What are you doing up?" She startled, truly startled, like a child caught stealing cookies. Her eyes darted to me, then back to what she was holding, a small white cloth, soaked through with red. "Cut myself," she muttered quickly, raising her hand. A thin strip of bandage was wound around her finger. I frowned. "That much blood from a cut?" She didn't answer. She just turned back to the sink, rubbing harder as though she could erase the stain by sheer force. I let it go. Maybe because I was too tired, maybe because part of me didn't want to dig deeper. We were younger then, and I still believed silence was safer than confrontation. But I never forgot that cloth. Now, with the box sitting in my living room, that memory pressed against me like a bruise. My daughter's words echoed in my ears. "One day soon you'll understand." Understand what? That the blood I'd seen wasn't hers. That there had been another story, another truth, hidden behind her trembling hands. I thought of my daughter as a teenager, the way she sometimes looked at her mother with a strange mix of defiance and fear. Back then I chalked it up to adolescence. Every teenager pushes against their parents, but what if it wasn't rebellion? What if it was knowledge? What if she'd known all along? Later that night I sat with my daughter's old photo albums. She'd left them behind when she moved out, tucked on a shelf we rarely touched anymore. I flipped through the pages, watching her grow in still frames, birthday parties, school plays, family vacations. And then I noticed something. In one photo, she must have been around 12, standing with me in the backyard. She was smiling, but her eyes weren't on the camera. They were on her mother, who stood just off to the side. And in those eyes I saw fear. It was subtle, easy to miss, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I closed the album and sat back, heart pounding. That box wasn't just a gift. It was a message. My wife knew what was inside. My daughter knew what it meant. And I was the only one still groping in the dark. The next day I tried again. We were sitting in the kitchen, morning light streaming across the table, when I said, "Do you remember that night, the one with the cloth? You said you cut yourself." Her spoon froze midair. Slowly she lowered it back into her bowl. "That was years ago," she said quietly. "I remember the blood," I pressed. "I remember the way you looked at me, like you were hiding something." Her eyes narrowed. "You're imagining things." "I'm not," I said, "and you know it." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. Finally she pushed back from the table, her chair scraping the floor. "I told you," she snapped. "Leave the past alone." Then she walked out, leaving me staring at her empty chair. Leave the past alone. But the past wasn't done with me. That night I dreamed of blood. I dreamed of a cloth, stained and wrung out, dripping onto the floor. I dreamed of my daughter, older now, pressing that cloth into my hands, whispering, "Do you see now, Dad? Do you finally see?" I woke drenched in sweat, my chest heaving. And from the living room came the faintest creak, as though the box itself had shifted. I told myself it was nonsense, just wood settling, just imagination. But deep inside I knew better. The truth wasn't asleep, it was waiting. The phone sat on the counter like another kind of box, silent, waiting, heavy with possibilities. For 2 days I'd circled around it, wanting to call my daughter, fearing what she might say, fearing what she might not. But silence eats at a man worse than bad news, and by the third morning I couldn't stand it anymore. I dialed her number, palms damp, heart thudding like it used to before big games in high school. She answered on the second ring. Dad. Her voice was low, cautious. Honey, I said, letting the word stretch. I hadn't called her that in years. I got your package. It's still here. I haven't opened it yet. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her breathing uneven, like she was weighing every word before she let it out. I know, she said finally. I frowned. You know. I know Mom doesn't want you to open it. Something in me stiffened. So you've talked to her. Of course I've talked to her. My daughter's voice faltered. Then softer. She doesn't want the truth out. The truth, there it was again, that slippery word dangling like a baited hook. I leaned against the wall, closing my eyes. And you do you. Her silence told me everything. Sweetheart, I said gently, I don't know what this is about. I don't know what's in that box or what I'm supposed to understand. But if you know something, if you've known for years, you can tell me. I'm your father. Another breath, and then her voice breaking like glass. Dad, I want you to be ready, that's all. When you open it, everything will change, and I can't protect you from that. I felt the air leave my lungs. Protect me from what? But she didn't answer. I love you, she whispered quickly, and the line went dead. I stood there, phone pressed against my ear long after the call ended. Protect me. What kind of daughter says that to her father? When I turned, my wife was standing in the doorway, her face pale. You called her, she said flatly. Yes. What did she tell you? Enough, I said. Her eyes narrowed. Enough for what? I didn't answer. Instead, I set the phone down carefully as though it might explode and walked past her into the living room. The box sat on the table waiting, always waiting. That night the tension boiled over. We were in the kitchen again, plates half filled with food neither of us touched. My wife's fork clinked against her plate, her eyes darting anywhere but mine. Finally, I broke the silence. She told me you don't want the truth out. The words hit her like a slap. Her fork slipped, clattering against porcelain. She doesn't know what she's talking about, she said quickly, too quickly. She knew enough to send me the box. Her jaw tightened. She's confused. She doesn't understand. Then help me understand, I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. Because right now I feel like a stranger in my own house. My daughter sends me a gift on Father's Day and you act like it's a curse. I call her and she talks about truths and protection. And you, I pointed at her, hand trembling. You keep telling me to leave it alone. Why? Her lips pressed together. Her eyes shone wet but no tears fell. Because once you open it, she whispered, you can't unknow what you'll find. Her words chilled me. Then let me decide that, I said quietly. But she stood, pushing her chair back, and walked away without another word. I sat there long after she'd gone, staring at the box across the room. I thought about my daughter's voice, breaking under the weight of what she couldn't say. I thought about my wife's trembling hands, her whispered phone calls. I thought about that bloodstained cloth all those years ago. And I realized, whatever truth they were both guarding, I was the last to know. The father, the husband, the one who should have been trusted first. Instead, I was left circling shadows, begging for scraps of answers. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. I slipped out of bed and walked to the living room. The box sat where it always did, small and unassuming. I lowered myself into the armchair, elbows on my knees, and whispered into the dark. What are you trying to tell me, sweetheart? Of course, the box didn't answer. But in my mind, I saw my daughter's face, 12 years old, eyes full of a fear I hadn't recognized then. And I wondered if she had been waiting her whole life for me to finally see it. The next morning, I made up my mind. I couldn't live like this, half in the dark, half drowning in suspicion. I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew one thing my daughter wanted me to know. And whatever my wife feared, it couldn't be worse than not knowing at all. So I picked up the box. I placed it on my lap. And with shaking hands, I reached for the tape. I never thought a small cardboard box could take over my life. But there it was, every morning when I came downstairs, every evening when I sank into my armchair. Always on the table, always waiting. I carried it once from the living room to the study, thinking maybe if I moved it out of sight, I could move it out of mind. But within an hour, I found myself bringing it back, setting it down in the exact same spot, as if the table were the only place it belonged. It wasn't just a gift anymore, it was a presence. That night after my wife had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room staring at it under the dim lamp. The box looked ordinary, brown paper, cheap tape, my daughter's handwriting scrawled across the top. Yet the longer I stared, the less ordinary it seemed. I swear it felt alive, not moving, not breathing, but alive in the way something carries weight beyond itself, like an heirloom, like a secret. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, my hands hovering just above the corners. My fingers twitched, wanting to tear through the tape, but I didn't. Something in me whispered, not yet. The days blurred together. My wife did everything she could to keep me busy, gardening, fixing gutters, errands in town. At first, I thought she was just restless, but then I realized it was all a distraction, her way of pulling me away from the box. One afternoon, I came back early from the hardware store and caught her in the living room. She was kneeling by the table, her hands pressed against the box as though she were praying over it. When she saw me in the doorway, she jumped, her face flushing. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. "Dusting," she said quickly, too quickly. "There's no dust on it." She glared at me, then stood, brushing past without another word. But I knew she wasn't dusting, she was guarding. That night, I dreamed again. In the dream, I sat in the same armchair, the box on my lap. My daughter was across from me, no longer the busy woman in her suits, but the little girl in her yellow sundress. She smiled at me the way she used to, gap-toothed, innocent. "Open it, Daddy," she said. I reached for the tape, my hands shook. And when I finally pulled it back, when the flaps opened, all that spilled out was light, blinding, white, endless light. I woke gasping, my chest tight. And when I looked toward the living room, I could have sworn I saw a faint glow around the box. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked it up, heavier now, though nothing had changed. My wife rushed into the room, panic etched across her face. "Put it down," she snapped. "Why?" I demanded. "Why does this scare you so much?" Her voice broke. "Because if you open it, you'll never see me the same way again." Her words hung between us, sharp as broken glass. I stared at her, at the woman I had built a life with, at the fear in her eyes. And for the first time, I wondered if our marriage had been built on something I was never meant to know. I set the box back down, but not because of her words, because of my daughter's. One day soon, she had said, "Be ready." I tried to live normally after that. I really did. I fixed the shed door, mowed the lawn, even watched a ball game on TV. But everything was hollow. Because no matter what I did, I felt the box calling to me. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even a thought. It was more like gravity pulling me closer, tugging at the center of my chest. I began to time my steps through the house so I wouldn't pass the living room. I began to eat quickly, avoiding the table where it sat, but avoidance only made the call louder. And every night I ended up back in the armchair, staring at it until my eyes blurred. One evening I reached my breaking point. I grabbed the box, carried it upstairs, and locked it in the bedroom closet. My wife begged me not to, but I told her I couldn't live with it staring me down anymore. But that night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the closet only feet away, until I finally gave in. I got up, opened the closet, and carried the box back downstairs. When I set it on the table, a strange calm washed over me. It belonged there. That's when I realized the box wasn't just calling me, it was claiming me. It had become a part of my days, my nights, my very thoughts. And whether I liked it or not, I was caught in its orbit. Soon, I told myself. Soon I'll open it, but not tonight. Because tonight I needed to remember the man I used to be. The father my daughter once adored, the husband who thought love was stronger than secrets. I needed one more night of not knowing. One more night before the truth changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My days rarely held surprises anymore, just the hum of ordinary life, punctuated by the quiet weight of the box. So when the bell chimed, sharp and insistent, I nearly jumped out of my chair. Through the screen door, I saw a familiar figure. Frank. My old neighbor stood on the porch, his shoulders stooped, his hair thinned to wisps of white. He'd lived 2 houses down for as long as I could remember. Once upon a time, we'd shared backyard barbecues, late-night beers, the kind of small-town camaraderie men build without much effort. These days, we only saw each other in passing. Age does that, it shrinks your world until it fits inside your own walls. Thought I'd stop by, Frank said, shifting his weight. Haven't seen you around much. I let him in. We sat in the living room, box sitting on the coffee table between us as it always did. Frank glanced at it, his brow furrowing. Got a package, huh? From my daughter, I said carefully. He nodded, but something flickered across his face, hesitation, maybe even recognition. We talked for a while, the way old men do, about the weather, about aching backs, about how the town wasn't what it used to be. But I noticed Frank kept glancing at the box, not just casually, almost knowingly. Finally, I asked, "What is it?" He looked at me, then leaned in. His voice dropped low, like a secret not meant to travel far. "You ever wonder what people say when you're not around?" I frowned. "What are you getting at?" Frank sighed, rubbing his hands together. "There've been whispers for years about your wife." The words tightened my chest. "Whispers?" He nodded. "Back when your daughter was younger, folks around here noticed things. Strange arguments at night, lights on when they shouldn't be. Once someone swore they heard shouting, screaming, even coming from your house." I shook my head slowly. "I never heard." "Of course you didn't," Frank said softly. "You were working, you were always working, but the rest of us, we wondered, we worried." I swallowed hard. "Worried about what?" He hesitated, then leaned closer. "That something happened, something that got buried, and your wife, she made sure it stayed that way." I stared at him, my pulse hammering. "What are you saying, Frank?" He shook his head quickly. "I don't know for sure. None of us do, but I'll tell you this, when I saw that box on your table, I knew it wasn't just any package, because some truths, they don't stay hidden forever." The room seemed to tilt. I wanted to demand answers, to make him spell out what he meant, but his eyes, tired, sympathetic, told me he'd already said as much as he dared. Before I could press further, the front door creaked. My wife stepped inside, arms full of groceries. She froze when she saw Frank sitting there, her gaze flicking instantly to the box. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply. Frank rose slowly. "Just visiting an old friend." Her eyes narrowed. "Well, you've visited long enough." The air crackled with something unspoken. Frank placed a hand on my shoulder before leaving. "Take care of yourself," he murmured. And then lower still, almost inaudible, "and be careful." After he left, my wife turned on me. "What did he say to you?" I met her eyes. "Enough." Her face blanched, then hardened. "Don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about." "Doesn't he?" I asked quietly. "Because it seems to me a lot of people know something I don't." Her hands trembled as she set the groceries down. "You're imagining things. They've always been jealous, spreading rumors, that's all." But her voice shook, and I knew she was lying. That night, Frank's words gnawed at me. Whispers, screaming, something buried. I thought about all those nights I'd worked late, all the times I'd come home to silence, never questioning what had filled the hours before. What had my daughter lived through while I was gone? What had my wife hidden, scrubbing at stains in the sink, whispering into phones, guarding secrets behind locked doors? The box seemed to pulse in the dark, daring me to open it, daring me to end the guessing. I sat there, staring at it until dawn, Frank's warning echoing in my ears. "Be careful." Careful of what? The truth or the cost of it? By morning, I knew one thing. The box wasn't just calling me anymore. It was closing in, wrapping around my life like a vice. And soon, I wouldn't have a choice. Because once a secret starts whispering, it doesn't stop until you listen. The house was too quiet that night. You'd think after 40 years of marriage, silence would feel familiar, even comforting. But this wasn't the silence of routine, of two people sharing the same air without needing to speak. No, this silence was sharp, heavy, like a blade pressed against the skin. My wife had gone to bed early. She didn't say good night, didn't kiss my cheek the way she used to, just closed the bedroom door with a finality that made my chest ache. I stayed in the living room, the lamp casting a dull glow, the box sitting on the table like a judge waiting for my verdict. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow I will open it. But tonight I needed to sit with the weight of what that meant. I poured myself a drink, bourbon, 2 fingers, and let it burn its way down. It wasn't the drink I wanted. It was the courage. The box was still sealed, the tape unbroken. My daughter's handwriting seemed almost alive now, curling across the surface like veins. I traced it with my finger, whispering her name under my breath. I wondered where she was that very moment. Was she awake, thinking of me? Was she afraid, relieved? Did she know the storm her gift had unleashed inside this house? For years, I thought distance was her way of forgetting me. But now I realized it was her way of carrying a burden I'd been too blind to see. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Memories flooded in, uninvited. I saw her at 10 years old, standing in the doorway after one of our family arguments. Her small frame trembling, her eyes darting between me and her mother, as though searching for safety and not finding it. I saw her at 16, walking out of the house late at night, returning hours later with red eyes, refusing to say where she'd been. I saw her at 20, hugging me goodbye before leaving for college, whispering in my ear, "Take care of yourself, Dad." At the time, I thought it was just something kids said when they left home, but maybe it had been more a warning, a plea. And now the box. The night deepened. The bourbon glass sat empty. The clock ticked past midnight, steady and unrelenting. I thought of Frank's words, whispered like a prayer before he left my porch, "Be careful." Careful of what? The truth or the cost of it? I rubbed my temples, trying to push the questions away, but they clung to me, sticky as cobwebs. I imagined tomorrow, my hands tearing through the tape, the lid lifting, the contents spilling out. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid of the box itself. I was afraid of what it would confirm, because deep down, I already knew. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep. I dreamed of my daughter again, sitting across from me in that yellow sundress, her feet swinging above the floor. She held the box in her lap, her small fingers caressing its edges. "Daddy," she said softly, "I saved this for you." Her eyes glistened, not with joy but with sorrow too old for a child to carry. "Why, sweetheart?" I asked. "Because you didn't see," she whispered, "and I needed you to see." When I reached for the box, she pulled it back. "Tomorrow," and then she was gone. I woke with a start. The lamp still glowed. The box still sat on the table, unmoved. But I swear the air around it felt different, charged, heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. I glanced toward the hallway. The bedroom door was still closed. My wife hadn't stirred. I wondered if she knew tomorrow would be the day. I wondered if she could feel it too, that inevitability pressing down on us like a weight we could no longer carry. I stood, pacing the room. For decades, I thought love was built on trust. But now, I understood. Sometimes love is built on silence, on what you choose not to ask, on what you pretend not to see. And silence can hold a marriage together for a while, but it can't hold forever. The cracks had been spreading for years. Tomorrow they would split open. I sat back down, leaning close to the box. My voice shook as I whispered, "Whatever you are, whatever you hold, I'll face you tomorrow." And in the stillness of that night, I thought I heard an answer. Not words, not sound, just a shift inside me like the turning of a key in a lock. Tomorrow, the truth would come tomorrow. I turned off the lamp, leaving the box bathed in moonlight. Then I climbed the stairs slowly, every step heavy with what waited below. In the bedroom, my wife lay curled on her side, her back to me. I slid under the covers, staring at the ceiling. Her breathing was steady, too steady, as though she were pretending to sleep. I wanted to reach for her to bridge the distance, but my hand froze in the space between us, because I didn't know who she truly was anymore. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I'll know. And with that, I closed my eyes, the box still burning in my mind, carrying me into uneasy dreams. The house was too quiet that night. You'd think after 40 years of marriage, silence would feel familiar, even comforting. But this wasn't the silence of routine, of two people sharing the same air without needing to speak. No, this silence was sharp, heavy, like a blade pressed against the skin. My wife had gone to bed early. She didn't say goodnight, didn't kiss my cheek the way she used to, just closed the bedroom door with a finality that made my chest ache. I stayed in the living room, the lamp casting a dull glow, the box sitting on the table like a judge waiting for my verdict. Tomorrow, I told myself, tomorrow I will open it. But tonight I needed to sit with the weight of what that meant. I poured myself a drink, bourbon, 2 fingers, and let it burn its way down. It wasn't the drink I wanted, it was the courage. The box was still sealed, the tape unbroken. My daughter's handwriting seemed almost alive now, curling across the surface like veins. I traced it with my finger, whispering her name under my breath. I wondered where she was that very moment. Was she awake, thinking of me? Was she afraid, relieved? Did she know the storm her gift had unleashed inside this house? For years, I thought distance was her way of forgetting me. But now I realized it was her way of carrying a burden I'd been too blind to see. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Memories flooded in, uninvited. I saw her at 10 years old, standing in the doorway after one of our family arguments. Her small frame trembling, her eyes darting between me and her mother, as though searching for safety and not finding it. I saw her at 16, walking out of the house late at night, returning hours later with red eyes, refusing to say where she'd been. I saw her at 20, hugging me goodbye before leaving for college, whispering in my ear, "Take care of yourself, Dad." At the time, I thought it was just something kids said when they left home, but maybe it had been more a warning, a plea. And now the box. The night deepened. The bourbon glass sat empty. The clock ticked past midnight, steady and unrelenting. I thought of Frank's words, whispered like a prayer before he left my porch, "Be careful." Careful of what? The truth or the cost of it? I rubbed my temples, trying to push the questions away, but they clung to me, sticky as cobwebs. I imagined tomorrow, my hands tearing through the tape, the lid lifting, the contents spilling out. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't afraid of the box itself. I was afraid of what it would confirm, because deep down, I already knew. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep. I dreamed of my daughter again, sitting across from me in that yellow sundress, her feet swinging above the floor. She held the box in her lap, her small fingers caressing its edges. "Daddy," she said softly, "I saved this for you." Her eyes glistened, not with joy but with sorrow too old for a child to carry. "Why, sweetheart?" I asked. "Because you didn't see," she whispered, "and I needed you to see." When I reached for the box, she pulled it back. "Tomorrow," and then she was gone. I woke with a start. The lamp still glowed. The box still sat on the table, unmoved. But I swear the air around it felt different, charged, heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. I glanced toward the hallway. The bedroom door was still closed. My wife hadn't stirred. I wondered if she knew tomorrow would be the day. I wondered if she could feel it too, that inevitability pressing down on us like a weight we could no longer carry. I stood, pacing the room. For decades, I thought love was built on trust. But now, I understood. Sometimes love is built on silence, on what you choose not to ask, on what you pretend not to see. And silence can hold a marriage together for a while, but it can't hold forever. The cracks had been spreading for years. Tomorrow they would split open. I sat back down, leaning close to the box. My voice shook as I whispered, "Whatever you are, whatever you hold, I'll face you tomorrow." And in the stillness of that night, I thought I heard an answer. Not words, not sound, just a shift inside me like the turning of a key in a lock. Tomorrow, the truth would come tomorrow. I turned off the lamp, leaving the box bathed in moonlight. Then I climbed the stairs slowly, every step heavy with what waited below. In the bedroom, my wife lay curled on her side, her back to me. I slid under the covers, staring at the ceiling. Her breathing was steady, too steady, as though she were pretending to sleep. I wanted to reach for her to bridge the distance, but my hand froze in the space between us, because I didn't know who she truly was anymore. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I'll know. And with that, I closed my eyes, the box still burning in my mind, carrying me into uneasy dreams. The cloth lay crumpled at the bottom of the box, small and unassuming, yet louder than any scream I had ever heard. It wasn't just stained. It was soaked, dark patches seared into the fibers as if time itself had failed to wash them away. Blood, old, dried, but unmistakable. My hands trembled as I lifted it. The fabric was stiff, brittle at the edges. I held it up in the morning light and saw how the stains spread like veins, branching outward, permanent. I heard my wife's sobs behind me. They weren't the quiet kind. They were guttural, raw, the kind of sobs that come from a place far deeper than grief. "Why?" I whispered, the word caught in my throat. "Why is this here?" She didn't answer. I pressed on. "Whose blood is this?" Still nothing. I turned, holding the cloth out. "Tell me." She flinched as though I had struck her. Her eyes darted to the cloth, then away, unable to hold its gaze. "I tried to protect you," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Protect me?" My laugh was hollow, bitter. "From what? From this? From the truth?" Her hands gripped the edge of the sofa, knuckles white. "If you knew, if you ever knew, it would destroy you." I shook my head slowly, the cloth trembling in my hands. "It's not knowing that's destroying me." For a long while, the only sound was her sobbing and my own shallow breathing. The cloth hung between us like a curtain we couldn't step around. I remembered the night years ago, the sink, the frantic scrubbing, the lies about a cut on her finger. I remembered the way my daughter looked at her mother sometimes with fear instead of love. And now this cloth, this box, this silence. Was it hers? I asked quietly. Our daughter's? Did something happen to her that you never told me? Her head snapped up, eyes wide with horror. "No, God, no." "Then whose?" Her lips pressed tight. And in that refusal, in that iron silence, I found my answer. It wasn't about what she said, it was about what she couldn't. I set the cloth back into the box with shaking hands. My throat ached with unshed words, my chest tight with a rage I hadn't felt in years. "I was your husband," I said, voice low but sharp. "I was supposed to be your partner, but instead you carried this alone, and you dragged me into a marriage built on secrets." Her tears streamed down her face. "I did it for us." "For us?" My voice rose now, bitter and raw. "Or for you?" She covered her face again, sobbing so hard her body shook. I sank into the chair, burying my face in my hands. The cloth still burned in my memory, seared into my vision. It wasn't just fabric, it was evidence. Proof of a night I hadn't lived but had haunted me for decades. And now it was here on Father's Day of all days, sent by the one person who shouldn't have carried this burden, our daughter. She knew, she'd known for years, and in sending me this she had chosen me. I stared at the box again, the flaps gaping open, the cloth lying inside like a wound that refused to close. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered, to no one, to everyone. My wife's sobs quieted. She looked at me through swollen eyes, her voice hoarse. "Leave it, please, just leave it buried." I shook my head slowly. "It's already out." Our daughter made sure of that. Her face crumpled and she whispered almost to herself, "Then it's over." The words chilled me. Over, not just a fight, not just a secret, something deeper, something final. I rose from my chair, the box still on the table, and walked to the window. The world outside looked unchanged, kids on bikes, neighbors trimming hedges, the ordinary hum of suburban life. But inside me, everything had shifted. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I couldn't look at myself the same way either. Because once you've seen blood, you can't unsee it. And once you've opened the box, you can't pretend it was never there. That night, the house felt like a stranger's home. My wife retreated to the bedroom. I stayed in the living room, the box at my side, the cloth folded neatly inside like a relic. I thought of my daughter again, of the courage it must have taken to send me this, of the pain she must have felt carrying the secret alone all these years. And for the first time, I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt responsible, because maybe she'd been waiting for me all along, to finally see what was right in front of me. I reached into the box one last time that night, my fingers brushing against the rough fabric of the cloth. I held it close, closing my eyes. And in the darkness, one truth echoed louder than all the others. This was only the beginning. I didn't touch the box again for a day. I couldn't. The sight of that bloodied cloth lingered in my mind like a brand. I could smell it when there was no smell, feel it against my hands even when they were empty. It was too much, too heavy. I told myself I needed time before I could face it again. But the box never let me go. That night I found myself staring at it once more. The flaps gaped open, the cloth resting inside, stiff and silent. My wife had shut herself in the bedroom. I could hear the muffled sound of her weeping through the door, but she no longer tried to stop me. Maybe she knew it was useless now. I sat down, pulled the box closer, and lifted the cloth again. And that was when I saw it. A corner of paper, folded, tucked beneath the fabric. My breath caught. My hands shook as I reached for it. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it free. It was a letter. My daughter's handwriting danced across the envelope. Dad. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. The first line blurred before my eyes, not because the ink was faint, but because my tears rose too fast. I wiped them away and forced myself to keep reading. Dad, if you're reading this, it means you opened the box. It means Mom couldn't stop you. I didn't want it to come to this, but I couldn't keep carrying it alone. You deserve to know the truth, even if it hurts. My throat tightened. I clutched the letter closer, eyes racing down the page. All my life, I've watched her hide things from you. I've watched you trust her, love her, build a life with her, and I wanted to believe she deserved it. But when I found the cloth, when I realized what she had done, I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't look at you and stay silent. I stopped reading for a moment, my breath coming shallow. My eyes drifted to the cloth on the table, its stains glaring in the lamplight. I forced myself to continue. That blood isn't yours. It isn't mine, but it belongs to something between us. A secret she buried, one she thought would stay buried forever. And maybe she told herself she was protecting you. Maybe she told herself she was protecting me. But all she was really doing was protecting herself. I can't tell you everything, not in this letter. Some truths have to be seen, not told. But I need you to know this. I believe you deserve to know. I believe you deserve to live in light, not in shadows. And I need you to believe me when I say I stand with you. My vision blurred again. I set the letter down, pressing the heels of my hands into my eyes. She knew, she had known for years, and now she had chosen me. I picked up the letter again, desperate for more. Dad, you once told me that scars don't make us weaker. They make us stronger because they prove we've survived. I've carried this scar in silence long enough. Now it's yours too, and I hope one day we can face it together. Don't hate her, Dad. I know you might, but don't. Just see her for who she really is, and then decide what you'll do next. Whatever you choose, I'll be here for you always. Your daughter. By the time I reached the end, my tears had fallen freely onto the page. The ink blurred, the paper crinkled, but I didn't care. I read the words over and over, each one cutting deeper, each one binding me tighter to the truth. She stood with me. She had seen through her mother's lies, and she had chosen to put her faith in me. For years, I thought she had drifted away because I wasn't enough. But now I saw the truth. She had pulled away because the secret was too heavy to carry under the same roof. And yet, even from a distance, she had never stopped believing I deserved the truth. I sat back, the letter trembling in my hands. My wife's muffled sobs carried down the hall, the sound of a woman who knew her walls had finally crumbled. I thought of our marriage, of the years built on silence, on trust I now realized had been misplaced. I thought of my daughter, of her courage to break the silence, to stand against her mother, to stand with me. And I thought of myself, a man who had worked, provided, trusted, and yet remained blind in his own house. The letter was more than paper. It was a mirror, and what it showed me was hard to bear. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the box on top of the cloth. I whispered into the empty room, my voice shaking. "Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you for believing I was worth the truth." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the letter beside me, the shadows stretching long across the walls. And I realized something. The box wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Morning light seeped through the curtains, washing the living room in a pale gold. I hadn't slept. The box still sat open on the coffee table, the blood-stained cloth and my daughter's letter resting inside like two halves of a broken truth. I felt old in that moment, older than my 60 years, as if time itself had pressed me down into the chair, forcing me to carry every silence, every unasked question, every moment I should have seen but didn't. The bedroom door creaked open. My wife stepped out. Her eyes were red, her face drawn. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of all her secrets had finally bent her shoulders. She saw the letter in my hand and froze. "You read it," she whispered. "Yes," I said. My voice came out steady, though my hand still trembled. "I read it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She sank into the sofa across from me, her hands twisting in her lap. For a long moment we just sat there, two people bound by decades, now separated by a truth that had finally clawed its way into the light. "Why?" I asked at last, my voice cracked, but I didn't care. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her eyes glistened. "Because I wanted to protect you." I shook my head slowly. "No, you wanted to protect yourself." Her tears spilled over. "Maybe both." The silence stretched, sharp as broken glass. I held up the letter. "She knew. All these years she knew. And you let her carry it alone." My wife sobbed, pressing her hands against her mouth. "I thought I could bury it. I thought if I kept it hidden we could still have a life, but she found it, and once she knew, I couldn't stop her from hating me." I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "She doesn't hate you, she just chose me because I was blind, but I wasn't complicit." For a long time neither of us spoke. The weight of decades pressed between us. Finally, she whispered, "What will you do now?" I looked at the box, at the cloth, at the letter, then back at her. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know this, I won't live in shadows anymore, and neither will she." Her face crumpled, but she nodded as if she had expected nothing less. That evening I called my daughter. When she answered, her voice broke. "Dad, it's me," I said. "I read your letter." A pause, then a trembling breath. And I believe you." For the first time in years I heard her cry, not the muffled kind, not the hidden kind, but open, unrestrained sobs. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for finally seeing." My throat tightened. "I should have seen sooner, I should have protected you, I'm sorry." "You don't have to be sorry," she said. "You just have to be here now." We talked long into the night about scars, about healing, about how love can be twisted but also how it can survive. She didn't tell me everything, not yet. Some truths take time to unfold, but she promised we'd face it together. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. As the days passed, the house began to feel different. Not lighter, not yet, but real. No more pretending, no more silence. My wife and I spoke less, but when we did, the words were honest, even when they hurt. Our daughter visited soon after. She walked through the front door, her eyes cautious but steady. When she hugged me, I held on longer than I ever had. She slipped the letter back into my hand, whispering, "This is our scar now, but scars mean we've survived." And I understood. Now I sit here telling you this story, not because I want pity, not because I want sympathy, but because I believe stories matter. They remind us that even in the darkest corners, even in the deepest wounds, truth has a way of breaking through. My daughter gave me a box on Father's Day. Inside was pain, but also inside was love, the kind of love that refuses to let lies define us, the kind of love that chooses truth no matter how much it hurts. Scars don't make us weaker, they make us stronger. They remind us that survival is possible even when healing feels out of reach. And if you're listening now, maybe you've carried your own box. Maybe you've buried your own truth. Don't be afraid to open it, because sometimes the only way forward is through the pain. So thank you for staying with me through this journey. Thank you for listening, for sharing these moments with me. If this story touched you, if you saw even a fragment of yourself in it, I hope you'll stay with me for the next one. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And above all, take care of yourself. May you have health, may you have peace, and may your family find the healing it deserves. From one father to all of you, thank you.